Hello and welcome to the Election Show. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And joining me today via Zoom is Matt McDermott, Communication Strategist and Vice President of Whitman Insight Strategies. Also with me, political analyst and political science professor at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Happy holidays, guys.
Happy holidays. So Monday, 538 electors in all 50 states and the District of Columbia cast their votes for the presidency. The Electoral College decisively confirmed Joe Biden on Monday as the nation's next president. He will be the 46th president of the United States of America, ratifying his November victory in an authoritative state-by-state repudiation of President Donald Trump's refusal to concede the fact that he had lost. The presidential electors gave Biden a solid majority of 306 Electoral College votes to Trump's 232. And as our viewers may know, 270 was the magic number that Biden needed to cross. So Trump, in that same margin, bragged when he won by 306 that it was a landslide when he won the White House 4 years ago. And so heightened security was in place in certain states as electors met to cast paper ballots with masks and social distancing and other pandemic precautions of the day. We know in Michigan, they've seen sort of violence at the State House. We've even seen it in Kansas, where Republicans have actually resigned. A mayor in Kansas resigned because of the violence and the death threats against her and her family. So the results will be sent to Washington, D.C. and tallied on January 6th. It's a magic day when a joint session of Congress over which Vice President Mike Pence, who's a Republican, will preside. So for all of Trump's unsupported claims of fraud, there was little suspense and no change as everyone on the Electoral College and the electoral votes allocated the proper votes to Biden and the president in last month's voting system. So election day, Democrats won. They beat an incumbent president, which does not happen very often, and more than 7 million people by a 7 million margin for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. Lincoln, I'll start with you. There are lots of articles, some that I've written myself, about this necessity to still remain vigilant, even though what I just laid out for us, the electoral process worked on November 3rd. We see the popular vote has matched the Electoral College vote. Joe Biden won more Electoral College votes. He also won the popular vote. Electors have gone to their state houses on December 14th. They will make sure it's certified with Congress and tallied on January 6th. Inauguration will be January 20th. I, however, still feel tense. I'm on alert, largely because the president has refused to concede. We now have foreign leaders who have acknowledged the president's win, President-elect Joe Biden. We've seen certain members of the Senate and the House acknowledge Joe Biden as the president-elect. Even Mitch McConnell has done so, but there's still quite a few Republicans in the Senate and the House, even writing letters saying that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president-elect. That's why I'm a little stressed and still feel like we need to stay on guard. Do you agree that we still need to stay vigilant, or are you feeling good and January 20th is going to come and you're just fine?
It's 2020. I'm never feeling good. But the short answer to your question is we do need to be vigilant. And I would say not just because of Trump's, not only that he hasn't conceded, he will never concede. He's not a gracious person. He's not going to do that. Let's just get that idea out of our heads. But he hasn't walked away from the legal strategy, and neither of his supporters. And they are bandying about increasingly just kind of out of left field or right or far right field ideas here. Calling the military to have a new election is an idea Michael Flynn, the disgraced former general, was suggesting. That is nonsensical and absurd, but enough people hold that idea that we have no guarantee of stability between here and January 20th. I think the mechanics of it will work, but the stability is what concerns me. Ron Johnson, a senator from Wisconsin who has disturbingly close ties to Moscow, held a hearing in the United States Senate this week where he just gave the Senate to these purveyors of disinformation who talked about all the ways that this election was stolen, none of which were true. That will continue. So my sense that even when Joe Biden does put his hand on that Bible and says that oath on January 20th, and I believe we will get there, but even when that happens, there are many in the country, including in the leadership of the Republican Party, who will not recognize his presidency. So we will see at various times over the 4, or if he serves 8 years when he's in office, people saying, when they don't like something he's doing, well, he's not the legitimate president. And also, we should be vigilant, not just about this election, but about our democracy. Because the subtext of this effort by Donald Trump and the Vichy Republicans around him to say that this election was stolen is to create a narrative where they can begin to roll back some of the gains we've made in our democracy, particularly around things like making it easier for people. And by people, I mean specifically African Americans, lower income people, Latinos to vote. Things we did going into the November 3rd election that they want to change because they feel it's not good for their political future. So yes, we should remain vigilant. And sadly, we should remain vigilant even beyond January 20th.
Well, I mean, Matt, I think what Lincoln lays out is one of the many concerns I have, which is Donald Trump has brought all of these failed court cases. He's 1 for 50, I believe, right now. The tally keeps going. But at some point in time, I worry that we actually could get a Republican who's a bit more competent and has a bit more of a airtight legal strategy, and will try and do the same thing either on a presidential level or even on the level of a governor or a senator, essentially saying, yeah, I don't like the results, so I'm just going to sue to get the results that I want. And so that's part of my concern. I think the violence is another concern for me. And then lastly, and I agree with Lincoln 100% that the president will never concede. I mean, he doesn't have dignity, class, or grace, but he's quoted as saying that he won't leave the office. And so what does that mean for us post January 6th and on January 20th, where we know we're not going to have a large inauguration because we still have a global pandemic and over 300,000 Americans have died. And so the pomp and circumstance may not necessarily be there, but we could see what we've seen in developing nations for decades, where some people are like, do we have 2 presidents? What is happening? Because one man won't move out of the White House.
Yeah, my concerns in the months ahead are both in the streets and in the courtrooms. I think we've started to see this week. You saw last weekend, Trump campaign and his supporters, including members of Congress and elected officials around the country, holding essentially a Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C., to give favor to their dear leader, who they think won this election, which ultimately led to violence in the streets. Members of that rally and his supporters essentially both stealing flags and stealing things from stores, assaulting other people on the streets. There were a number of stabbings that took place after that. There's a real threat of violence that still exists because of the language and the rhetoric of this president. He is telling people who want to believe in something that they're right to think that there was something wrong with this election when there just wasn't. And the fact that Republicans have not come out and put a stop to this is frankly unacceptable, and more people need to start speaking up about it, because that violence will only continue if it's not quelled by members of that party. So that's one thing we need to be concerned about. The other is, to your point exactly, look, their effort to steal this election was obviously not successful. Joe Biden is the next president and will be the next president. My concern is that this sets a precedent for the future. This sets the precedent for any Republican to essentially say, one, elections aren't fair. Republicans either have won the election, and if Democrats have won, something was awry in the outcome. Or two, it then forces, particularly in the state legislatures, Republicans to continue to pass laws to suppress voters. They've been doing this for years. This is their electoral strategy, is to prevent Democrats literally from voting. And we should expect that not only to continue, but to increase in the years ahead, recognizing the precarious electoral position they're in right now. So those are my concerns, is both from the perspective of violence, we've already started seeing it, and Republicans need to step up and put a stop to it, or be held accountable for it. And on the other hand, Democrats need to get ready at the state level, because Republicans are going to start passing laws that prevent people from voting to ensure that they can still stay competitive at the local, state, and federal level in the years ahead.
Right. I mean, it's so fascinating that a robust electoral process, even without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we've seen young people, people of color, Black people explicitly, poor people, recently documented folks participating, and the Republican Party strategy is to say, that's actually illegal, it's fraud, and we need to change it immediately, which is the opposite of what American democracy is supposed to be. But we know that it will definitely happen on the state house level, and we need to remain vigilant on that end. Shifting gears ever so slightly, Lincoln, I want you to help us walk through this idea of this historic administration that Joe Biden said that he wanted to have. His campaign promise in choosing Kamala Harris as the first woman of color as a vice presidential elect, he said that he wanted his cabinet and his administration to reflect the diversity of America. So here are just some of the nominees. They haven't been confirmed yet by the Senate. It really does depend on whether or not Mitch McConnell will let any of these folks through. But we've got Kamala Harris, as we know, first woman of color, Jamaican immigrant, Indian immigrant, child of Indian immigrants, identifies as Black American. As you have rightfully pointed out, one of the first sort of elected officials on the presidential or vice presidential level west of the Rockies, which I think geographically is really fascinating. So we've got Kamala Harris. We've got Pete Buttigieg, right? Nominee for Secretary of Transportation. Historic moment for LGBTQ plus Americans. First Black Deputy Secretary of of the Treasury, Mr. Adeyemo. He would be making history. Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen, first Treasury Secretary. She'd be the first female Fed chair. Alejandro Mayorkas, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security during the Obama administration. He would be the first Latino and immigrant nominated for DHS Secretary. The list goes on and on. Deb Haaland, Democrat from New Mexico. She's been selected to lead the head of the Interior, which is huge. As a Native American, we've never had someone in modern history in the cabinet. She was just elected in 2018. I mean, so he's trying to sort of put the cabinet to look like what America could look like. Now, we still have to figure out what AG looks like, but we'll get to that in another show. But do you think that this descriptive representation is enough? Because some people have argued that some of the selections, let's just say Pete Buttigieg, transportation, Marcia Fudge in HUD, when lots of people wanted her to be in agriculture. Do you see this as window dressing? Because Susan Rice in domestic policy, when many people think that she should be in international policy, are we sort of like putting diversity in there for diversity's sake because some of these people's skill sets don't seem to necessarily match the office that they're in?
Well, first, I just want to clarify. Kamala Harris is the first person from west of the Rockies to be elected as a Democrat to national office.
Yes, of course, Democrat, right? Because we know Reagan and Nixon, right? And let's also be clear. All of these people that Biden has nominated and hopefully will go through confirmation, all of them are exponentially more qualified than every single person that Donald Trump has put in office. Let me just put that out there. Exponentially qualified. So I want to make that very clear, but it does seem like certain people would feel a little bit of a better match in other offices.
Really, since the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, we've seen efforts. We've now had 3 Democratic presidents, Clinton, Obama, now Biden, and they've all sought to have very diverse cabinets. That's been a driving goal of every Democratic president. It will continue to be. So I think while we talk about it as being historic, we need to understand it in that context. It's a continuation of an important trend. It's not groundbreakingly historic in that sense, although there are individuals, Buttigieg and Haaland come to mind, who are really playing groundbreaking roles in that regard. I think that when you talk about someone like Alejandro Mayorkas and say he's the first Latino secretary of DHS, that's true. I don't know that that's groundbreaking in that sense. He's also the first Jewish DHS secretary. I don't know that that's groundbreaking either, right? But in terms of this question of descriptive representation, I'm not sure how much I really feel comfortable getting into that. It is clear to me that a lot of what Biden has done is he's taken the straight white dudes who he wants and filled in everything around him. So maybe that's a more clear way to say that. So some examples are you put Blinken at state and Jake Sullivan at national security advisor, and now where do you put Susan Rice, who admittedly is going to have a hard time being confirmed, but is supremely qualified for both of those positions? Well, the obvious thing to do would have been to put her as national security advisor, but he wanted the white guy there, Jake Sullivan. Now, in reality, when it comes to actually whispering in Biden's ear, are Susan Rice and Jake Sullivan 95 out of 100 times whispering the same thing with regards to national security? Yes, probably. So you look at Pete Buttigieg, right? A hugely important person in this administration, kind of the person who he's brought in, other than Kamala, who's his running mate, who has the most name recognition among the American people, who has the biggest future. You know, Pete Buttigieg could run for president in the year 2040 and be 20 years younger than Biden is today. That's how young that dude is, and that's how bright his future is. But is he really, what does he know about transportation? You know, South Bend, Indiana has 60 buses, right? I mean, this is not an area of expertise, right? He might be better off in Veterans Affairs, but he wanted Dennis McDermott, who seems like a very competent guy, but is essentially just a generic Democratic Party insider. So I worry about that it's still being driven by the white men, and we'll see what happens with the AG pick. And then for me, from the substantive policy side, the most interesting pick is Janet Yellen at Treasury, who comes out of a much more progressive background than anyone who's held that office really in modern times. But, you know, and is not, and yes, is a woman, but is a white, you know, Gentile straight woman. But she's from the kind of, if you're talking about the kind of left generically, that's the biggest win the left has had in this cabinet. The foreign policy team is, you know, standard Democratic Party policy establishment. Tom Vilsack at agriculture. I mean, Vilsack's a competent guy, but that is a deeply uninspired pick. I am a little concerned, but I also think we should give this some time. And we also should know that we might be designing unicorn cages here, because if the Republicans win one or both of those Senate races, Mitch McConnell could say none of these people get confirmed. Right. That's entirely plausible as well. And
the idea that Mitch McConnell, who's a longstanding friend of Vice President or President-elect Joe Biden, would just hold up the process for holding up the process sake is not surprising, but it's really indicative of where we are in hyper-partisan politics. Matt, what do you think about some of the selections for cabinet? I mean, of course, you know, as we've joked, Lincoln is the king of low-key shade, the 60 buses in the fourth largest city in Indiana, right? Which I think, you know, is a valid concern. Yes, you may love transportation, but what does that mean, right? Marcia Fudge may have lots of thoughts about HUD, but many people thought that, you know, obviously agriculture would be a better fit. So, but these are also smart people who care about this nation and want to put the train back on track. And I think I want you to sort of walk us through, so many people want this radical transformation of folks, you know, and I've tried to explain to my students and other people where we are so far off the track as a nation. Many folks sort of want like a monorail. It's like, well, this is the time to, you know, reimagine everything and build the monorail. It's like, no. We're so far off the track. We actually just need people to put it right side up before we can even think about a light rail and all this modern technology that you want. Because our democracy, you know, until January 20th at 2 p.m., I mean, we're kind of still hanging off that ledge. So what are your thoughts about some of the cabinet picks?
I mean, that's exactly right. We need a presidency that can put us back on the train tracks and get us to the next station. But to your question, I just want to be unequivocal in this. Representation matters, and diversity in representation matters. And if you are not sitting at that table, far too often you are on the menu. And we've seen that happen in frankly, every Republican administration of the past few decades. That diversity in the cabinet matters because it means that LGBTQ voices can be represented. It means that Black and Brown voices can be represented. It means that people of all faiths can be represented in this government. It means that both genders can be represented. That matters when it comes to policymaking in particular, which is why cabinet diversity is such a hot topic and should be regardless of party affiliation, because we need that representation in the room. I think the struggle, which is a good struggle to have that the Biden transition team is facing, is that there's actually a pretty deep bench of Democrats at this point in all levels of government. There are obviously people on the left who have been around for decades, who are experienced, who understand how Washington works, and those voices are obviously important to have. But we've also seen, particularly after 2018, a real interesting, engaging, intellectual, diverse bench of Democrats come up after that 2018 midterms. And you're seeing those folks being represented in this administration as well. People like Deb Haaland, who you mentioned, in Interior, who literally was elected in the 2018 midterm, and now will not only represent the Interior Department, but will be the first Native American to do so in the cabinet. So we're finding ourselves with a bit of a tension in that we're trying to find these experienced voices, positions in our government, while also trying to give a voice and give a role to this next generation of leadership. And I think particularly for that next generation, it's something that the Biden transition team should continue to focus on, because I think we can all agree that regardless of what happens in the next 4 years, Joe Biden and his sort of perception of the Democratic Party is not what the future of this party is. We are having a number of new perspectives, of new voices, of new diversity coming into this party, and that will be its future. And the ability to have leaders like a Pete Buttigieg, like a Deb Haaland in this cabinet, I think really does give a nod to that next generation, that they should feel included in this conversation moving forward. Because the reality is, not only in 2028, but thinking towards 2024, it's entirely possible that we find ourselves with a very big tent of a Democratic Party and new faces looking towards the presidency. And we should be cognizant of those, even with Joe Biden as the president-elect.
Right. And I think, one of it is sort of like an embarrassment of riches. The Democratic Party has so much diversity. How do we encapsulate it? And actually, how do we sort of bring it to a coalition, right? A working coalition, because we have so much diversity. Now, this is something we talk about every week, and I want to make sure we never put it in the backdrop, and that's the COVID crisis. Because all of these conversations, the backdrop is COVID. Right? We won't have a major inauguration of Joe Biden and the first Black woman as vice president of the United States because they are concerned about so many people gathering. So we won't have to deal with Donald Trump saying his numbers are bigger than their numbers, even though we know that he will still probably say that. But they're actually encouraging Americans not to travel to Washington, D.C. We're pretty sure that the president will even stage his own counter protest just because that is what he does. But Lincoln, the first responders started getting the vaccine this week. Actually, my sister, who's an MD in Philadelphia, received the vaccine earlier this week. We saw Mike Pence publicly take the vaccine. And there's this real disconnect. It's been interesting to read stories about the disconnect between doctors who were signing up to take the vaccine, but nurses who live in red parts of states who are Trump supporters primarily, saying, no, they don't want to take the vaccine. So even in the healthcare community, there's diversity in a partisan, sort of hyper-polarized sense. But we are now over the 300,000 mark. And Donald Trump essentially will leave office by hook or crook with these deaths on his hands, and the Republican Party as well. How does Joe Biden come in and sort of set the stage, not just for healing, but helping red states? I mean, all states are red states, but red states with governors who do not want to work with Joe Biden, who do not want to face the facts that COVID is real. How does he come in and convince them that they must take the vaccine seriously, still take masks seriously, and social distancing, all the things that Dr. Fauci has told us for months on it?
To understand what the situation Biden will confront in January, right now we're losing 25 to 3,000. We no longer blink when we lose 2,500 people in a day to this, which is what we lost on September 11th. But to understand what Biden will confront, it is worth it to think about last March, where essentially the position of Donald Trump is that COVID makes me look bad. And the position of the Vichy Republicans around him was, we're not going to talk about this because it will hurt Donald Trump's feelings. For the most part, neither of those two things have changed. Donald Trump still doesn't want to talk about it, and the Republican Party doesn't want to talk about it either because they don't want to hurt Donald Trump's feelings. Now, the reason that's relevant is that unless that does change, Biden can't do anything. We have, since the election, we have talked so much, not we on this show, but we as the kind of commentary, those of us who write and think and talk about politics, what can Joe Biden do to bring the country together? What can Joe Biden do to get us past this COVID crisis? And Joe Biden can't do anything as long as the position of the Republican Party is that we will destroy this country and we will let thousands of Americans die every day rather than hurt Donald Trump's feelings. And as far as we can see, as I can see, that remains their position now. Now, I guess the one thing that might change this is that beginning January 21st, they will start blaming Joe Biden for this. They'll blame Joe Biden for the whole crisis. Now, what can Biden do? That's a very difficult question. On the one hand, Biden can do what he's doing already, which is to keep saying, I'm the president for all America. Whether you voted for me or not, I want to be your president. I'm going to fight for you, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that's important is if on January 20th, 21st, he's at 60, 65%, then when he says wear a mask, or when he says the vaccine is fine, and when he begins to organize people to publicly go and get the vaccine, then it can begin to make an impact. But as long as the Republicans remain committed to doing anything in their power, remember when Mitch McConnell says, my goal is to make Joe Biden a one-term president, as he did about Obama, if he says that about Biden, that means his goal is to slow down the vaccination process, because that's how Biden will be evaluated. And that means his goal is to kill thousands more Americans.
Right. And Matt, in the last few minutes, I mean, it's interesting to see whether or not McConnell will change his strategy. When Trump is gone, possibly might he just sort of say, okay, now let me actually get serious about this. He's, a little long in the tooth himself. So might he change course just a bit when he doesn't have the bully looking over his shoulder?
No, I mean, look, Mitch McConnell is the worst person ever elected to federal office in American history, and stop. So sort of moving beyond that.
Good night.
Just moving beyond that. Look, to sort of answer your question, there's a lot Joe Biden can do, and it sounds cliche to say, but he can lead because that is something that's missing right now. And I think we should be increasingly concerned as a country in the news that is coming out this week, and I think will turn into a crisis in the days and weeks ahead. It seems increasingly obvious that the strategy that's been presented from the Trump administration about this vaccine distribution program that they've put in place is a complete fallacy. There is no distribution program whatsoever. You've seen comments coming out of Pfizer in the last day suggesting that they essentially have tens of millions of vials of vaccines ready to go out to states across America, and they have no comment from the federal government in terms of where those vaccines should be going and who should be getting those. So essentially we have a situation right now where Pfizer has a warehouse of vaccines that could save thousands of lives, and no one in the Trump administration is doing anything to get those out to the American people. That alone is something that can immediately happen on day one in a Joe Biden administration. It seems like we have the ability in the next 4 months or so to basically vaccinate every American and end this catastrophe in this country. The reason it's not happening right now is because of inept leadership by Donald Trump.
Right. And sadly, a logistics problem is actually going to prevent us from actually moving forward with this, which is a tragic, a sin and shame, and as Lincoln has said, criminal in the past. Gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for being here with me. Thanks again for watching the election show. Be safe. Have a great holiday. Bye.